Judging by most economic statistics, the economy is doing great. So why are so many people so negative about the economy? Will Stancil is a research fellow at the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity, and he joins the podcast to talk about the disconnect between the facts about the economic conditions we have right now and people's sentiments about the economy. Why do the vibes feel different from the statistics? We talk about whether the economy is actually good or bad. Is inflation the cause of the negative sentiment, or could it be something else? What role do social media systems play in this whole episode? And are there media incentives to produce negative coverage? As always, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Please remember to drop us a like, a subscribe, a comment. All of that is appreciated. If you really want to support the podcast, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/newliberalpodcast. You can also support us by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism, our parent organization. Join a local chapter, get benefits like bonus episodes and stickers of the month, and support our work. Once more, thank you for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson. Joining me today is Will Stancil. Will, welcome to the show.
Hi.
Today we're talking about the vibe session, and people call this a lot of things, but the essential phenomenon that we're seeing here is that the economy, in a lot of ways, objectively appears to be pretty good. And we can get into exactly what we mean by that, but there's evidence behind that. But people's opinions about the economy seem to be really, really negative. And this has led to a lot of discourse, a lot of people screaming back and forth at each other on social media, and a lot of, very distraught op-eds, people trying to diagnose the problem. The whole round of, public opinion having is happening right now. I think the first thing we have to do, before we get into larger theories about why this is happening, what this all means, is just describe the situation on the ground. How good actually is the economy? Do the people who are negative about the economy, do they have a case? What are the facts on the ground here? So how would you describe the economy and kind of the state we are in right now?
I think that most of the indicators we traditionally use to measure economic performance are pretty strong. And I'm going to caveat this and say, I am not an economist. So I don't want to dive into the long-term outlook of, the labor market or anything like that. If you prognosticate about the future, I'm sure that there's, lots of complexities there that I'm just not aware of. But generally speaking, I think when you talk about is the economy good, you're talking about things like unemployment, which is way down. You're talking about things like GDP growth, which is way up. You're talking about things like real wages, which are currently up. There is inflation, but the inflation has basically slowed or almost stopped, I think. And there is consumption is up. Job satisfaction is high. Also, all these sort of traditional basic indicators would suggest that we're in the middle of a pretty strong economy. And I've seen people say things like we're in an exceptionally strong economy. We're one of the best economies of the last 20 years, one of the best economies of the last 50 years. I don't think it's even that important to litigate if it's strong, very strong, or incredibly strong. I think it's certainly on the positive side of the balance.
What seems interesting to me is, you can argue what counts as strong, what doesn't count as strong. Maybe your point of view is that, well, the economy's never been good because working people still have it, blah, blah, blah. And you're making some point about the conditions of working people, and maybe that's fair. But the change in the last few years, it certainly seems to have all been headed in the right direction compared to where we were in COVID. Or even compared to where we were in 5 years ago, it seems better. Or you could even make a comparison to international countries, right?
Right. I think that the comparison I've used mostly is 2019. And the reason for that is that in 2019, people generally thought the economy was pretty strong. There was very high general economic sentiment as measured by polls. I think it was sort of widely acknowledged in the press the economy was good. And compared to 2019, we're basically outperforming 2019. And so I think that, if obviously this is all relative. You could say that there are certain long-standing problems in the U.S. economy, income inequality, racial inequality, worker power, unionization, these sort of things that are persistent over time. But those things existed in 2019. They still exist today. I would say, in many cases, they've improved a little bit between now and 2019. But overall, we do seem to sort of be on this upward trend.
And doing better than most of our peer countries. You know, if you look at statistics, it's like I think the U.S. has had the fastest growth coming out of COVID of any major economy in the world.
Right.
And,
yeah. I mean, I think that if you look at if you look at the UK, the economy is pretty dismal. Canada, the economy seems to be in pretty tough shape. And generally speaking, a lot of these countries are coming out of COVID. They have a lot of the problems that we have. They have inflation in particular, but they haven't seen the growth that we've seen. And so I think that compared to, I don't know if that's that's sort of a different comparison. And people could say, well, I think it's complicated to talk about coming out of COVID because the economy dipped pretty strongly during COVID. And, there's a question of have we come all the way back up? But we're sort of beating the world right now compared to 2019 when the economy is good. Most indicators are pretty strong. I mean, it's just very difficult, I think, to make the case that we're not generally performing well economically. And again, there are caveats to this, but I don't think, that's always the case. I mean, I think that it's very hard to find a time in the last 50 years where there wasn't something you could look at and say, well, this is the dark lining on the cloud.
So despite this, lots of people think the economy is bad when they're answering surveys or whatever, or just talking in the social media sphere or what have you. And this has now become a topic of discussion. There's lots of people who are debating why this is. And, you have become kind of a character in this drama. You are one of the people very much advocating that, no, the economy actually is very good. And this is a puzzle. We have to understand it. But there are a lot of people who insist, and maybe it's a reasonable thing, a reasonable impulse, I will say, that like you can't dismiss people's ideas. People are telling you the economy is bad. Don't dismiss them and just be like, well, actually, the economy is good. I get that impulse to some extent, but I'm going to try to do a good faith interpretation here for the people who, are arguing out there. Well, actually, the economy is quite bad. Is there any kind of steel man case, good faith attempt, actually maybe they have some kind of case?
Right. So I think there's a few things. There's clearly inflation. You have over the last few years, it kind of depends on how you cut it, but over the last few years, it looks like that real wages have declined a little bit because of inflation. There is the ending of us in the U.S. of these very generous COVID subsidies that have left people maybe feeling like that they have less money. And then there's also things like the housing market. The housing is and rental housing is really expensive at the moment. So there are things like this, and of course, and the bigger thing I would say is it's not really these things, but there is a constant reality in the United States that we have poverty. I mean, poverty still exists, and I don't want to downplay this. You have a lot of poor people. You still have racial inequality. You still have income inequality, and these are sort of omnipresent in the U.S. A lot of people are very concerned about these problems, and they still exist. And so I wouldn't want to downplay that. I think what the puzzle is that for the most part these things are better than they were, or at least equivalent, and yet people are much, much, much more upset. If you look at surveys of the economy, you have something like consumer sentiment I saw is equivalent essentially to where it was in 2009. In 2009, we were coming out of we were really still in an enormous recession, a historic recession. Now there's nothing like that. We're seeing massive economic GDP growth. We're seeing wage growth. We're seeing low unemployment, and somehow people are all nearly as upset.
It's definitely a puzzle. And I think, we obviously have some theories about why this is happening. I want to acknowledge at the beginning of this, because we're probably about to start talking about the political camps involved here, right? And I want to acknowledge, look, I am on the center left. I am this is a moderate Democrat organization, more or less. And it is part of who I am that I enjoy punching left and I enjoy making fun of the extreme wing of the Democratic Party. And I'm acknowledging that, I am probably not an unbiased observer here. But at least when I look at it, it definitely looks like, to some extent, there's just a wing of the Democratic Party that would rather be miserable and would rather convince themselves that things are terrible rather than admit that something good has happened in the world, or in the economy, I guess.
Right.
And please feel free, because I know you're probably a little bit further left than I am.
I am.
If I am, punching left unfairly, please feel free to contradict me or whatever. But that's just what I see.
I would describe myself as a progressive liberal, whatever that means. I'm not, I voted for Elizabeth Warren. I think I am a little further left than you. It has been difficult in the course of this debate to not punch left a little bit, just because some of the ideas coming out of the very far left of the Democratic Party and then coming from people who I would say are, not really in the Democratic Party, far left, have been a little silly, I think. But with that said, I don't want to overdo it. I don't want to attribute everything to this group. When I look at the mismatch between sort of economic sentiment and the seemingly strong performance of the economy and these sort of hardware indicators, I really, and I've thought a lot about this. I mean, this is a topic this has obsessed me. I think I started tweeting about this and talking about this in late 2001. So I mean, I've been kind of fixated on this for several years, and it's gotten more.
2001. That's quite a long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think even before the initial burst of inflation, I said Biden's economy.
Do you mean 2021?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Let's go back to that. Yeah, I was about to say that's 2001. You've been on this beat for a long time.
No. So I've been talking about this for a long time. I think I initially started paying attention to this and saying that there's some sort of mismatch going on here in late 2021. And I think at that point I said, I was saying, Biden's economy looks pretty good. People seem pretty upset. Something's happening. And then over time, the mismatch really seems to have gotten greater and more inexplicable. And really, there haven't been a lot of solutions. People have thrown out a lot of different ideas. I have my own sort of pet idea, which we'll get to. But no one has really resolved this. And so when I think about it, I really think that there are 5 halfway decent explanations of what's going on here. And the first one is what I would call media vibes. And we're going to probably talk about that more because that's sort of my big thing. The second one is what I would just call inflation and sticker shock, that people really just hate inflation. They hate seeing prices go up, and it's just made them really unhappy despite everything else that's going on. The third one's housing costs. And a lot of people say, this is the core of it. I don't find this one particularly convincing, but we can talk about it. The fourth one is what I would call sort of the social structure argument, that a lot of the gains that are happening in Biden's economy are going sort of to the lower rungs of the economic ladder. They're going to people who are working class. They're going to people who are entry level. And those are people with less presence and less visibility. And in some way, this is causing people, the idea that the economy is bad to circulate more widely. And then the fifth one, which has sort of been trendy recently, literally in the last few days, is that it's the ending of the COVID subsidies, that people are reacting to the ending of the things like the super dole and the student loan pause.
Let's talk about a couple of things that we think it's probably not, that are theories out there we think are probably not true, and we can kind of talk about them quickly and move on to the ones we think are true. But let's start, for instance, with housing. I'm a big housing guy. You will find nobody who wants to build more housing and lower the price of rent, and it talks about it obsessively more than I do.
Absolutely.
Why is that not a good explanation?
A couple of reasons. First, most people in the United States the focus of a lot of this discussion has been on rent. I think that has to do with the fact that a lot of the people who are really talking about this are younger and renters. But most people in the United States are actually homeowners. About 66% of Americans live in a home that is owned. Right now, home prices are really high. Interest rates are really high. So it's a really bad time to buy a house. But most people are actually paying less for their house because interest rates fell during COVID, and a large number of people refinanced. So housing costs in homeowner homes are down. Rental prices are up. Rent spiked up in 2020 and 2021, but that spike has really leveled off. And so really the really intense housing price hit came a few years ago. And then when it subsided, and it has started to subside, it seems like, there really wasn't a recovery in the economic sentiment overall. The other thing is I'd say that rents, although, in coastal areas, in these high price coastal areas like New York, housing prices are extremely high. Overall, rents went up about 20%, which is really about what inflation went up. And it's what about wages have gone up. So there's not, even though rents are up, it doesn't seem like that they're up. You'll hear people say 100%. And that's just not really true. So I just don't really find this super persuasive.
Yeah, and I think you would be able to find some sort of breakdown in like, oh, look, if we could tell that renters were way less happy than homeowners and that there was a change there, I think that would probably be in the data somewhere. So I find myself probably agreeing with that. We still need to build more housing, lower the cost of rent. Like that's still something we should do. But
and I'm sure it's not helping to have people, people's rents go up. Of course, it's painful, but I don't think that it explains this huge disconnect you're starting to see between how people feel about the economy and how it measures. I mean, the other thing I'd like to point out, there was a Financial Times article a few days ago, essentially predicting what economic sentiment would be in all these different countries, and then showing what the actual one was. The only country with this gap is the United States, but a lot of these countries, Canada, UK, they are having a housing cost spike just like we are. So if it's housing, it really should be in these other places too, and it's not. I just don't find this the most persuasive explanation.
All right. A second one that probably neither one of us finds that persuasive is the idea that these COVID programs are ending, whether it's the child tax credit or the, direct checks, $2,000. We're not going to get into the debate about how you add up to $2,000 again, God forbid. That the student loan pause, all of this stuff has basically faded away by now. And the idea here, as I understand it, is that, well, people got all this stuff and their situations improved because of all these very generous programs, and now they're gone and people are unhappy.
Yeah, so there's a few things that I think are a problem with this explanation. One is that people were pretty unhappy while these programs were in effect. They sort of, depending on the program, they all sort of rolled in 2020 and rolled out sometime in, between the end of 2020 and 2022. During this period, that's really when economic sentiment was really low. It's possible, of course, that people were really unhappy then about unemployment, and now they're unhappy about the programs being gone. But it doesn't really make sense for me to say people are longing for a return to 2021. That's not a time that people were overjoyed in the first place. And I also lived through 2021. It wasn't a great time. 2020 is sort of notoriously a terrible year. There's another issue with this, which when you ask people what about the economy they dislike, they don't say, we're not getting checks from the government. They say prices. They say inflation.
And I mean, look, I agree here. I am one of the people who probably was the biggest CTC boosters in American politics. I was out literally on the streets at one point, gathering signatures to send petitions in to Congress members, please renew the CTC. But it pains me to say that the CTC, right, the child tax credit, does not actually poll very well. And it baffles me that this is the case because it was such a good program, I think. It cut child poverty in half or whatever the number is, maybe slightly less than half. But the CTC didn't poll very well. People didn't actually like it that much. And that really disappoints me. But, you can't say that's the reason that people are unhappy is the CTC ended or student loan forgiveness ended, because those are not broadly popular programs. They're, student loan forgiveness is like the mecca, the holy grail for 10% of people. But everybody else doesn't actually seem to like it that much. So I think you're right that this kind of stuff doesn't actually work very well as an explanation.
Right. That's actually exactly what I was going to say. It's the politics.
And I mean, the politics are interesting here because just mechanically, I think we're going to start to get into some stuff here that I think does have some legitimacy. I'm not sure if it's all the way legitimate, but these are at least contributing factors that I think we have to pay attention to. The politics are interesting because it's not just a Democratic story. I think it's also a Republican story. We know that when there's a Republican president, Republicans are happier and Democrats think everything is shit. And when there's a Democratic president, Democrats are happier and Republicans think everything is shit. But I feel like that is not entirely a symmetrical thing. at least the numbers I've seen show that when the Republican kind of electorate, the Republican public swings really, really hard as soon as Trump is out of office, they go from thinking everything is great to everything is terrible almost overnight. And even the most extreme part of the party is basically just willing to do that. They answer the poll question like they're voting. They're just giving a vote to Donald Trump by saying either everything's great or everything's terrible. Whereas some Democrats do that, but there's also a group, I think, that is just never satisfied. No matter who's in power, those Democrats are always voting no. The economy is terrible and I hate the vibes. And I think part of me thinks that's why like Joe Biden's approval is so low and like the vibes on the economy are bad, is that Republicans are more willing to just answer poll questions loyally, if that's a thing.
Right. So there definitely is. First of all, you're totally correct that responses to economic surveys like this are highly partisan, particularly for Republicans. And to me, this is the single biggest clue about what's going on, maybe that there is. That if you ask people how the economy is doing, Republicans, when Donald Trump's president, they say it's great. And then the moment Donald Trump stops being a president, they say it's terrible. And not only does that sort of give us a clue about, the headwinds that Joe Biden is sailing into, it tells us something about how people think about these questions. And I think that this gets a little bit into, this gets a little complicated. But one of the things that people tend to do when they read these poll answers, when they read these surveys, how is the economy doing? How do you feel about the U.S. economy, or the many different variations it's asked? They tend to assume that everyone is just directly reporting their personal experiences. So if you feel good about the U.S. economy, it's because good things are happening to you. If you feel bad, it's because bad things are happening to you. And if that's the case, the answers to these polls should just pretty much reflect what's happening on the ground in the economy. If there are more people for whom good things are happening to, then that, it's going to be broadly positive. If most people are having bad things happen to them, it's going to be broadly negative. But I think that if you look at this sort of partisan response trend, what you can see is that people aren't really reporting what is happening to them. They're reporting other things. And one of those things is politics. But I don't think it's just politics. I think there's other things happening in there too.
All right. So another idea that we brought up that, again, we're starting to get into some of the stuff that is going to have some legitimacy here. And we can debate whether it's enough legitimacy, but inflation. Inflation has been a big economic story for the last few years. In a lot of ways, it's been really interesting if you just put on your economist hat and your analyst hat and just, look at what's happening. It's really fascinating because the U.S. hasn't had inflation for a long time.
Right.
We went 30 to 40 years basically with near zero inflation. The 90s were almost all pretty low inflation. The 2000s, all low inflation. All through the 2010s and the Great Recession, the Fed was trying to get more inflation and couldn't. And all of a sudden, we get this big burst of inflation. We get a huge fiscal spending program. There's a lot of supply restrictions and inflation skyrockets. And part of me just thinks, we're just relearning the lessons from the 70s. We just forgot, like institutionally, we forgot how much people hate inflation. They just hate it.
Right. So I think that it's clear that inflation is playing a large role here. I think that probably the consensus among political scientists and economists is that most of this is just inflation. And I think it'd be impossible to deny that inflation is, not playing a large role. For one thing, the peak of sort of economic unhappiness pretty much corresponds with the peak of inflation. For another, if you ask people what the problem is, they just go prices, 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 prices. It's overwhelmingly the issue that is on people's minds. And as you said, so one of the things that's interesting here is that there have been a lot of attempts to sort of measure what factors play into these economic sentiment surveys. Up until 2020, you can plug in, basic economic indicators like unemployment and, interest rates and inflation, and pretty consistently predict what people are going to say. And then in 2020, the trend just breaks. There's this big gap that emerges. The model stopped working. And so what that suggests is that even though if inflation is playing a role, something has changed about the way that people perceive inflation. And it may just be what you say, that people just aren't used to it. And so it feels like a total disaster to people today in a way it didn't before. But I kind of think that there's more to it than that. I think that part of the problem here is not just that we're having inflation, but we're talking about inflation all the time and getting upset about inflation all the time. And that is feeding back into how people feel.
I saw some research the other day, and I wish I could find this because it's not in front of me right now, but there was some research that suggested like inflation and unhappiness kind of operated with like a 6-month lag or something of that nature, where, people don't feel the inflation right away, or they don't react to it right away. And 6 months after it happens, maybe even 6 to 12 months, all of a sudden they start getting unhappy. And then even when inflation goes down, which at this point we're under 3% inflation, I think, but people are not going to realize it or kind of feel it for another little while. This was kind of posted as an optimistic thing, like, oh, maybe Biden will be fine by next year. But do you think that has any credence?
Maybe. I don't know. I think that there have been a lot of efforts recently to just try and figure out exactly how inflation is impacting the sort of consumer sentiment and economic sentiment. There's a lot of theories. And the assumption behind all of them is that there's essentially just kind of a mechanical operation here. That if you can find the right formula, you just plug in the economic data, and then you'll know what people are going to be thinking in 6 months. Broadly as a Democrat and a liberal, I hope that's right. I hope that people, in a year from now have mostly moved past it. I hope that the economy is still good and we've kind of forgotten about this whole thing. I'm a little skeptical of that. I think that the reality of it is a little more complicated. And the reason for that is that I think people are being influenced in part by, again, what they're reading and hearing, and that conversation doesn't really change predictably. There's actually an interesting paper out there by a professor named Darren Grant, and he essentially did the same thing. He was using a couple polls. One's just sort of general economic survey. Another one's question: are you better off or worse off? He plugs in a bunch of indicators and tries to figure out how you model it. And he decided that his regression model showed that if you put in real wages instead of inflation, you can get a somewhat more accurate model. And I think that this sort of so these sort of efforts to figure out what exactly the terms in the model are sort of persistent. But I have to say, I just thinking about how these ideas form, thinking about how people talk about them, I'm a little skeptical that there's this one-to-one relationship between the quote unquote quote real indicators on the ground and what people are thinking in the realm of politics.
So we're going to get to kind of the big theory, which is the social media and the general media landscape, which is influencing people and how that's working. We're going to get to that very soon. I want to give you one more technical indicator, even though you've just told me that, technical indicators are maybe not the best way to go about this. You're not going to find the right one, but I'm going to give you one more because I think this is an interesting way to think about it. And it's that, it's not just that we've had real wage gains in the last few years, and real wages went down for a little bit, but now they are back up. They're above where they were in 2019. And what's interesting is that specifically real wage gains have been concentrated at the lower end of the wage spectrum. Low wage workers have seen the highest gains. And perhaps this, people say, is actually going towards a negative sentiment that this is causing services and things we purchase to be more expensive. Things like delivery and restaurant food and just stuff like that are more expensive. And people notice that really acutely. And that people are actually kind of unhappy, middle class and or upper class people, that this kind of tightening of inequality has happened.
Right. So I think that this is a pretty important component. I don't know quite how it plays into how people feel. There's a couple of different ways it could. One is what you said, that people are just mad that they're paying more for stuff or services they didn't pay for, as much for before. One of the things that someone said to me the other day, I'm really sad that I can't go to the grocery store at 3 a.m. and, buy groceries at 3 a.m. And the reason you can't buy groceries at 3 a.m. is that grocery stores, it's not efficient for grocery stores to keep workers on site at 3 a.m. when you're paying them more. And so you do have this sort of degradation of services. I mean, a lot of people have noticed during COVID that service industry interactions got worse because you're dipping deeper into the labor pool. And you have people who are less qualified, who would ordinarily not get hired, who are getting hired. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is I've heard this class resentment theory where you have people you say, well, a lot of people sort of in the wealthier parts of the economy just kind of resent that the gap is shrunk, that they are closer to the ground a little bit, that they are no longer able to look down on wait staff. I don't find this particularly persuasive. It's a little bit psychological for me, but it's something that people have suggested. And then I think the third one, which to me is most persuasive because of how I sort of think about the media component of it, is that people, with the gains so concentrated on the sort of lower half of the economy, this is the most invisible part of America. This is not a group of people who is famous for being, prominent in politics or powerful. With the gains concentrated in that part of the economy, the other half, the half that is prominent, to them everything looks a little bit worse. And so their idea that, maybe things aren't so great has radiated out through their platforms, through media, through their influence in politics, and that might be skewing how people see the world.
Yeah, so let's get more into depth about that, because this is something that I find kind of persuasive, but I think it requires an explanation. It requires deep analysis, because this is something that you can't really put numbers to, right?
Yeah.
The benefit of trying to do a metric is that if you just find the right metric and it actually explains it, well, then you can just say, well, went up by 2 points. We should expect sentiment to go up by 2 points as well. People are going to feel better. All is good. It's very mechanical and mathematical and predictable. Whereas when we talk about social media and vibes and just kind of the system of how social media works and echo chambers and promoting certain viewpoints, all of that is true, but it's hard to describe in kind of as factual a way, as mathematical a way. So we've got to kind of dive into it. I guess I'll start by asking, what's changed? Because again, we're talking about a change in sentiment. So you would expect there to have been a change in the media, because the media has always existed. So what has changed in social media between now and, say, 2018, 2019, that you think is causing this sort of thing to happen?
Well, I think we should actually take a step back for 1 second and think a little bit about why media is important. Because I think to a lot of people, this is unintuitive. They think, well, of course, media has some influence, but, aren't I mostly thinking about my real experiences, my lived experiences? And I think there's an inclination to take that as sort of the default theory of how the world works. But I think if you think about it, you'll realize that most of what you know about the world outside of yourself isn't coming from your direct lived experience. I mean, so I live in Minneapolis. I see a little bit of Minneapolis every day. I see a little bit more, over the course of a year. I hear about it a little bit more through my friends and my acquaintances. But if that's all I had, I wouldn't know anything about the rest of the U.S., much less the rest of the world, much less people like Joe Biden. Any of this would just be just totally unknown to me. So any information I'm getting about these topics is pretty much coming to me through some form of media. And when I'm talking about media, I'm saying broadly defined. So I mean, newspapers, television, computer, websites, social media, whatever.
You're just saying the way we perceive the world is socially constructed.
That's right. And it's coming through, it's coming through these, what we would describe as media platforms. And, some of it is coming through also through my friends, but they also don't have any direct experience. So they're getting it through these media platforms. So my experience of this sort of larger world is largely based on my media diet, my information diet, and my friends and acquaintances' information diet. So if you frame it like that, you realize that this is not just one little component in how I understand the world. It is really kind of upstream of everything I know. And so if this media that I'm consuming is accurately conveying the world to me, some sort of objective way, if that's possible, then yeah, sure, we can just sort of take it out of the equation. But if it's tilted one way or another, then my view is going to naturally be tilted. I don't have an independent basis to understand these things. I can't sit around and just sort of divine facts about the world from, the ether by meditating in my room. Someone's got to tell me about it. And so what I think is really important here is if you look at the sort of major media ecosystems in the United States, most of them in the last few years have had a pretty strong bias towards economic gloom.
And do you think this is something that's changed recently? Because again, we're trying to explain the change that's happened since 2019. So that would imply that there's been some change in the way the media operates. Do you think that the media has been increasingly focused on the negative under Joe Biden or just in a post-COVID world, whereas they used to not do that? They used to tell more positive stories?
So the way I see it, and this is a little bit of a simplification, is that there are three basic media ecosystems or streams in the United States. And, we can split them down further, but I think these three big ones are a good way to think about it. One is what we call the legacy or mainstream media, and it's newspapers, it's the New York Times, it's TV channels, it's just all the traditional stuff, the stuff that's been around for 100 years. One is what I would call just the right-wing media ecosystem, which can be online or, Fox News, but these are all just partisan GOP outlets. And a lot of people get a lot of news from that.
There's Newsmax and all, yeah.
Newsmax and OANN and all of that. And then also Ben Shapiro and, just a huge ecosystem out there. And then the third one I would say is social media. And that's Twitter and Facebook and Reddit and, all of that. And I think if you look at each one individually, you see that there are changes which sort of tilt us towards this gloomy economic mindset. I think that if you look at the mainstream media, there's a really high priority is appearing neutral. And I think you can see this for instance, if you look at the Donald Trump presidency, there'd be a real tendency to sort of frame everything in a way that gave Trump the benefit of the doubt. Or you see stories that are along the lines of, well, Trump's crazy, but you have to admit the economy is good. And the reason these stories have a lot of appeal to a lot of mainstream outlets is that they tend to make the outlet look more unbiased, more objective. They're willing to give them credit when they can. And you see the exact opposite trend with Joe Biden sometimes, where in order to look like they are not simply doing Democratic Party propaganda, there's a tendency to accentuate the negative, to say, well, and there's a really great Brian Beutler who is, am I saying his name right?
I actually have no idea, but it's funny that the social media account who I think of when I think of this is the New York Times pitch bot, who will often make fun of, that unemployment is falling. Here's why that's a problem for Biden. And I think the New York Times has actually run stories that are almost verbatim like that headline, but
right. And so someone went through on Twitter and compared a bunch of headlines. So Trump would get 200,000 jobs in a month and they'd say, great job report for Trump. Joe Biden get 200,000 jobs in a month, and they say, good job report, dark clouds on the horizon. And you would consistently see this sort of thing. For about a year there were a lot of predictions that we'd be in a recession, and they were constantly put at the front of these legacy outlets. The other thing I would say about the legacy outlets, like the Times and the TV news, is that they understand what sells. They understand what draws eyeballs. They're an economic enterprise. And grabby, emotional, scary headlines do better than things are good and get better. That's a boring headline. Recession on the horizon. That's an exciting headline, and there's real incentive to write this way. And so I think that this is something that is tilted the legacy news towards again this sort of economic gloom.
Yeah, I think you're also right to emphasize the headlines because if we're being real, nobody reads articles.
Right.
Certainly nobody reads books. God forbid anyone ever read a book when you could watch a 12-second summary of the book on TikTok. But nobody reads books and really nobody reads articles. They do read headlines, though. And I think most of the reporters out there are trying to do a good job. They don't have this really consciously in their head. And most of the articles are pretty fair and pretty fact-based. But, if the headline is clickbaity, that's all that people are going to see sometimes. And that matters.
People in news, people in media, without, trying to accuse them of anything, they understand that they need their articles to be shared to succeed. They understand they need to draw in eyeballs. And if you do this for a long enough period of time and you're any good at it, you start to understand what plays better. You understand that a grabby headline with a scary number or a scary prediction is going to do better than it's complicated. And so, this is just a product of the economic incentives of news as a business.
I definitely get that. It's funny. I find myself agreeing and disagreeing a bit here because I've got friends in the business, and like I know people who've worked at CNN, and like during the Jeff Zucker years, for instance, Jeff Zucker would sell his grandmother into slavery if it got him another quarter points of the Nielsen ratings. Like Jeff Zucker would do anything. It's funny. He wasn't actually ideological. He would just do anything for ratings. Some of the other networks and some of the other institutions, I actually think, have stronger safeguards against that kind of stuff. But it's hard to be completely safeguarded. The incentives are always there. I had an economics professor who told me the entire field of economics can just be explained by two words: incentives matter. And, incentives can be really strong things. It's hard to ignore them for very long. I don't know.
And I think that actually leads us to our second media ecosystem, which is social media. And social media is important both because it is a place where people communicate directly with each other, where people create ideas and spread them around sort of outside this sort of institutional framework of traditional media. It's also a place where a lot of information from traditional media spreads. And the incentive on social media, I think, is just, these days, it's just unambiguously strong emotions, doom, 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 doom. I think that if you look at what gets spread, what goes viral, it's very rarely optimistic. It's very rarely complex. It's very rarely nuanced. It's almost always, this thing is bad and you should be upset. The strong emotions that provokes clearly gets people to press the retweet button, to share, to like, to subscribe, whatever. And it really encourages people to frame their views around those emotions and to find ways of describing the world that fit into that framework. The other thing about social media is that because you get such instantaneous feedback about exactly how many retweets you've gotten, exactly how many shares you've gotten, you can really almost test your way into what works. I mean, and I know this is someone who's been on Twitter for a while. I'll tweet something and I'll think, this is it. This is going to blow up. I know that it has the right emotional edge to it, the right, anger or whatever in it, and it's going to explode. I'm sure I'm not that particularly good at this. There are people out there who are really good at this, and they are, if we're being realistic, they're shaping the way they describe the world to try to get the spread. Again, this isn't really an indictment of them as a person. It's just a product of the incentives that social media creates. And the other thing I'd say is that because so much legacy media spreads through social media, those same incentives sort of trickle up into legacy media. There's a real incentive to frame your headlines in a way that it's going to blow up on Twitter. It's going to blow up on TikTok. And so you can even see.
Well, and every writer at every mainstream publication is addicted to Twitter. And this is not a small factor in how the media ecosystem has developed over the last decade.
Right. One of the things you hear a lot is that Twitter doesn't matter because barely anyone's on it. First of all, I'd say that's a little bit of an overstatement. It's something like 15, 20%, which is bigger than any news network. It's bigger than any newspaper. But also the people who are on Twitter are people who are really influential elsewhere. So if something blows up on Twitter or something plays well on Twitter, it tends to sort of trickle down both towards, into other social media networks. It goes on the Reddit, people screenshot it on Instagram, people put it on TikTok. It also tends to trickle up into how legacy media reports stuff. So if you talk about something over and over and over and over on Twitter, for instance, the Vibe session, you'll start to see it popping up in headlines. You'll start to see it popping up on other social media platforms. In some ways, this debate over the last 4 months has been a proof of concept of that.
Yeah, and these days it's even more TikTok, I think, than Twitter. It used to be, there's a really interesting graph I've seen, which it tracks the beginning point of most socially shared things. Because a lot of times you'll see there's a Facebook post with a picture of a tweet, right? Or something like that. But the origin site is Twitter. And it tracked of all the stuff shared across all social media sites, where did it actually originate? It used to be dominated by Twitter, but just in the last year, TikTok has passed it. Stuff on TikTok is now being shared on Twitter more than the reverse. And stuff on TikTok is being shared on Instagram and Facebook and wherever. And I think TikTok, especially because it's so dominated by young people, is really a breeding ground for this. And if I pick my own, the scab that I like to pick at is that I really think this is an ideological thing to some extent. Yeah, and I'll say it's not just a far left thing. I think it's a function of being on the extreme on either side, that it's to your benefit to sell that the world is terrible, the world is falling apart, whether you're advocating for, socialist revolution or some sort of weird fascist Trump cult, rightist revolution. In order to do that, you need to sell that the world is awful and that we need this kind of revolution. And so you're just incentivized to make everything about doom all the time. And, the nature of social media is such that extreme points of view like that seem to spread much, much faster than kind of optimistic things.
So I think the basic tension of all media is that you want to attract an audience. You want people to hear what you're saying. And that's if you're writing for the New York Times. It's also if you're just some guy making TikToks, to send out to your friends. And generally speaking, the best way to get people to listen to what you're saying is to tell them what they want to hear. And I think this tension exists. And again, this is not restricted to social media in any way. I mean, it's the same thing. You see the same thing. Fox News is essentially just telling Republicans what they want to hear over and over and over, and has used that to form a really large and loyal audience.
Yeah, even outside of politics, like if you look at the other parts of Twitter, Stan Twitter, right. With Beyonce stans, the Bayhive, the Swifties, the K-pop armies.
I can't say I spent a lot of time on Beyonce Twitter, but I'm sure it's exactly the same.
But they're very intense bubbles. And, right. You will be in a bubble of people who have dedicated their lives to BTS, the K-pop band, and they don't understand that nobody else even cares or has even heard of BTS because, they're just getting fed what they want to hear. It's the algorithm.
Right. And so I think this is true even without an algorithm. But in legacy media and a lot of media, there's a lot of sort of friction between that incentive to tell people what they want to hear and then actually doing it. For instance, if you write something in the New York Times, everyone's going to see it. So the people that like it and the people that hate it are both going to see it. You need to write something that is not going to, you can't just totally go off in the deep end because it's something you'll get called on it. Another thing is that you have institutional structures. You just have rules of journalism. You can't just go out there and lie. You'll get in trouble. You'll lose your job. Social media reduces a lot of these frictions. For one thing, you don't have those same rules. You can really just go out there and tell lies and for the most part get away with it. What's happened over time, though, is that social media has also added in these algorithms, which makes it even stronger. So you say something, and then the social media site takes what you said and delivers it to the exact population of people that wants to see it. And the social media site that has really done this the best is TikTok. TikTok is infamous for this. You don't even have to follow anyone. You just go in there and start swiping through videos, and after an hour or two, it figures out who you are, what you want to see, and it just starts delivering that stuff to you. It doesn't even matter if it contrasts with a bunch of other stuff on the site. It'll never show you that site. You can live in your perfect little bubble all day.
Will, are you saying that people on TikTok lie on the internet?
Yeah, I mean,
that doesn't sound right to me.
Hold on to your seats.
They wouldn't be allowed to put it on the internet if it was wrong.
That's true. Yeah, that's what I think. No, but I think one of the things you see when you talk about this is people get really upset. They say, "Why is TikTok so bad? Why is it any different from anywhere else?" And I think it's a complicated question to answer because on one hand, the basic incentives here are not limited to TikTok. They're not even limited to social media. On the other hand, TikTok has really accentuated this dynamic that is a problem wherever it appears. And so TikTok isn't uniquely bad, but it's kind of the worst at this specific thing. And it also includes a population of young people who are, actually, we don't have to get into that. That's a little complicated.
Let's say they're more likely to live on the political extremes. And I think that might be true, certainly to the left, maybe even to the right. There's a lot of weird young rightists now that are not even just normal Trump people. If normal Trump people is a thing, they're like the weird types, the tradcaths. I don't know. I think that weird young people have I don't think that's actually very controversial that young people have weirder ideologies than people who have aged up and kind of calmed down a little bit.
Well, another thing about TikTok is because the incentives are so strong because TikTok's algorithm is so effective at delivering content to the people that want to see it. It creates a really powerful incentive to sort of figure out what people want to hear and create that thing. And the result of this is that you have young people going on there, kind of figuring out what ideas are popular among their peers, repeating them, and then going viral.
You're kind of hinting at the idea of like audience capture here, that not just you define your audience, you influence your audience, but your audience influences what you do.
You have every incentive to just say what they want to hear. And then on the other side of that, what the audience is seeing is people that look like them, that sound like them, that are from their generation, who are just kind of regular people. These aren't necessarily anybody, saying these ideas. I mean, and what's more persuasive to somebody than hearing someone who is essentially like them explain something that they want to hear? Especially the young people, I think, who do tend to be somewhat more susceptible to peer pressure, to tend to want to align with their peers. And so in a lot of ways, TikTok does have this sort of consensus formation mechanism, I think, for young people that is uniquely intense. And so to me, this is why TikTok is troubling and has nothing. I'd also like to point out this has nothing to do with China at all.
Fair enough. And I mean, I think one of the best pieces of evidence here that this is happening in this particular way, because again, we can't really point at numbers here. We're telling a story. We're doing some analysis, some elegant English to kind of explain this all. But I see this happening in more than one area. It's not just the economy, because most of the podcast has been focused on the idea that people are unhappy about the economy, despite the fact the economy is really strong. But I see this happening in a lot of places. Like I'm an eternal optimist. My point of view is that the world is almost continually getting better, especially if you look at like long time frames. The world is a better place than it was 30 years ago. Poverty is lower. Gay rights are better. Women's rights are better. Racial inequality, I think, is improved. And certainly if you compare it to 60 years ago or 90 years ago, on the long run, I always believe the world is getting better. But I look online and like something I saw the other day was somebody saying, and this is Israel, Palestine, but it was brought up that like, oh, you're gay. Why are you supporting Palestine? Because they behead gay people there or whatever. And regardless of getting into that, not even getting into the issue, but their response was, you say that they treat gay people badly in Palestine, but what about America, huh? And I just thought that was such a crazy response to act like, have you been to America? Like they said, I live in Massachusetts and it's terrible here too. And I was like, the governor of Massachusetts is an open lesbian, ma'am. Like, I don't know what to do about that. But I see this kind of dynamic where there's just this incentive to say that everything is terrible all the time, whether it's in regards to civil rights, whether it's in regards to the economy. You sometimes see it with climate, that like some crazy number, like 40 to 50% of young people think they're going to die in the next 20 years because of climate change.
Yeah.
And I mean, like I said, I don't know what to do with this information, but it's out there.
Yeah. No, and I would say that I'm, broadly, maybe because I'm a little more left wing, I'm broadly less optimistic than you are. I think there are real problems out there. I'm very scared of climate change. I'm very scared of Donald Trump. I think that there are potential for real catastrophes that could affect all of us or a lot of us in really horrible ways. I think that a posture of just unrelenting doom, of unrelenting fear and unhappiness is not necessarily responsive to those issues. I think, and I think you see this a lot. A lot of people will say, these climate change is going to kill us. Donald, we're going to turn to a fascist country. And to me, I hear this, I think that's possibly true. The solution here is to get out there and go solve these problems, in particular by voting, being active in politics, and trying to promote people who want to solve these problems. And what you hear back a lot of time is, no, we're too doomed. The only possible solution is revolution, which I'm not going to launch. So we're just going to be miserable. And I think that when I hear that, what I think is this is a posture this is a posture of emotional indulgence in a lot of ways. People, want to feel these strong emotions. These strong emotions play well online. They are compelling to their peers. They are compelling to strangers on the internet. And they are finding the ideology that allows them to indulge in these strong emotions. In a lot of ways, I think that this kind of resembles, frankly, what you see from the Trump people. The Trump people don't really have necessarily a coherent ideology. They have views that are contradictory. But what they really seem to want to do is take refuge in these really strong feelings ignore the illogic of them, the contradictions, not resolve those things. They want to be told that they are just allowed to be mad, upset, scared all the time.
Yeah, the whole "Make America Great" thing, get our country back. It's really about just a feeling of loss more than it is a particular type of economic indicator.
Right, and I think you see the same thing sometimes. The same sort of, I would call this a reactionary instinct. I think you see the same kind of reactionary instinct sometimes on the left side of the spectrum, particularly on the very far left. And I think it's encouraged somewhat, or actually encouraged a lot by social media, to simply just sort of indulge in these strong feelings of anger and loss and despair. To the people that are doing it, I think it can feel cathartic.
Can I throw the word trauma in there as a word that's often kind of used in these spaces? Like, if you dare to be optimistic, you're invalidating someone else's trauma.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely hear that, and you can sort of see the echoes of what I'm talking about. That I do think sometimes there's a little bit of a over focus on the particular language, just because this is the vocabulary that people use. And validation, trauma. I mean, I know this is sort of therapy speak, but people at all times and places have different words for these things. So I don't want to over focus on the precise words being used so much as I want to talk about that this instinct towards just indulging in strong emotions, and without sort of the moderating influence of being asked to think through them, to being asked to respond to them productively, to ask to solve the problem, to take contrasting ideas and synthesize them together, possibly coming to uncomfortable conclusions or having to make compromises. I think that this sort of avoidance of compromise in favor of just feeling all the time is something that is strongly encouraged by social media, and is strongly encouraged in this sort of youth culture that has been created by social media. And I think that this has led to a lot of pessimism, frankly.
I think that's right. And I mean, look, when I say I'm optimistic, I'm never saying that like climate change isn't a problem, or there's not still issues in the sphere of civil rights, for instance. We still have a lot of work to do. I just think that, we've made some progress, and we can continue to make progress if we keep working. And I think the point that you made, which is really valuable, is that if you actually care about doing this, if you care about changing the world for the better, rather than just maximizing how sympathetic people are to you and maximizing the amount of tweets you're going to get, then it's not just that doomism is wrong and doomism is factually incorrect about the economy. It's that it's not helpful either. Like you're not going to make the world a better place by just posting about how everything is shit all the time. That doesn't help anyone, and it might actually hurt. So, it's just one thing to consider, because what are we going to learn from this? Like one of the sad points of this is, what are politicians going to learn from this whole episode is, well, we went really big in 2020, and we thought that was the right thing to do because we knew that in 2008 we didn't go big enough. We didn't do enough stimulus. So we went really big economically in 2020. We did all $1 trillion bills and direct checks and multiple $1 trillion bills even. And we really put people to work, and we were punished for it because there is no tolerance for inflation, or there's no tolerance for whatever else. And just people will never be happy. So we're not going to do it again. Like it sucks if that's the message that ends up coming out of this, right?
Right. I mean, you want to be able to. So for a long time, to the extent that anyone knew about me, they knew me as the guy that would go on Twitter and complain about Joe Biden and Democrats a lot. I complained about Joe Biden and Democrats a lot. I thought they weren't tough enough on Trump. I thought that Biden was too willing, too eager to make a compromise. Just you name it, I complained about it. And one of the things that's funny about sort of recent developments with the economy is that now I've become known as the guy that loves Joe Biden, but that's also not really true. I think what's important is to say, you want people to be better, and then you want to be able to take yes for an answer. You need to be able to say, that you made the right decision, and so because you made the right decision, we're going to reward you and try to help you out, or else no one's going to ever listen to you again. And who's they going to listen to? They're going to listen to the people to the right of you. They're going to listen to the Trump people. They're going to listen to the people that are,
So with all that said, we're coming up on time now. So I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask here. And that is, what would you recommend for people who want to learn more about what we're talking about? And this could be learn more about social media systems and how they work, learn more about the actual state of the economy as opposed to the vibes. People just who are interested in what's going on out there and what you and I have been talking about, what would you recommend? And this could be like authors who are good to read, blogs, websites, just people to follow on Twitter, anything that you think would be valuable for people who want to keep learning about what we're talking about now.
One of the things I think is interesting about this is that, especially about the role of vibes and social media and sort of the social consensus and shaping these perceptions, is, I mean, this is a field that has been studied a lot in political science and economics, but no one really has a great answer on all this. One thing you'll see a lot is you'll point out this mismatch between how people feel and the real indicators, and you get a lot of people come in and say, "Oh, it's obvious. It's this thing. It's this thing. It's this thing." And I can't tell you for sure what's happening here, but I can tell you one thing, which is not obvious. No one really knows. So there really is a pretty active discussion on Twitter about this. So there are a few people on Twitter that talk about this sort of stuff a lot. I personally feel like I talk to Matt Darling about this every day. I know Jolie Politano talks about this a fair amount.
Matt Darling, chief neoliberal shill, by the way. He won our last shill bracket, which is one of my favorite things that we do. Yeah.
Congratulations to Matt. No, and so there are, you can follow this discussion some on Twitter. The other thing I would say is that when you see these headlines with economic statistics, every Americans can't wrangle up $500 in emergency. 60% of people are living paycheck to paycheck. I would say that it would be, you should look up, it's good to look up the data yourself. It's not that hard to look up some basic economic statistics and understand them. You can usually Google stuff. You'll get it from the FRED, which is the Federal Reserve Economic Statistical Database. There's statistics from Bureau of Labor statistics. These sort of long-running federal agencies have better data than themotleyfool.com. Don't get your economic data. Don't get your economic data from Wall Street Bets on Twitter. Don't get it from these sort of fly-by-night sources. Go look it up from somewhere credible, and you really learn a lot about the economy that is not obvious from the narrative, I'd say.
All right. Well, I guess we will see what's going to be happening. We've got about 12 months till the election. It remains to be seen if economic sentiment will improve since then. Inflation seems like it's come down. If we have a full year of low inflation, will that help? We don't really know, but we're going to have to find out. Will, thank you so much for coming on. I wish you all the best in your continued Twitter fights. So I want to thank everybody. Thanks for listening. My guest today has been Will Stancil. Thank you for coming on the show.
All right. Thank you.